Hello, everybody. My name is Zagaria Buckley. Thank you so much for coming to this newly virtual conversation. I'm the Director of Art Exhibitions and Outreach here at the University of Southern Maine. I'm a curator and writer. I manage the art gallery at the university, and I also oversee our Artist in Residences program. A quick note, apologies if you hear my husband, dog, or baby, or as is likely, all three at once. But tonight we will be in conversation with the artists in our current exhibition, Life Forms Grow. And I'm just going to share my screen for a quick moment here. Life Forms is a sculptural collective of 12 artists and an experiment in artistic community building. Through a series of exhibitions over 4 years, each in a different location and featuring a different subset of artists, the group aims to deepen relationships with each other and discover new connections through their work. The University of Southern Maine Art Gallery has the pleasure of hosting the first exhibition, Life Forms Grow, featuring Jackie Brown, Leah Gauthier, Elaine K, and Ashley Page. Running from January 16th through February 15th, the works in this exhibition span a wide range of interpretations around the word grow, from the growth of biological life, as well as that of knowledge across cultures, to shape-shifting materials that blur the real and the imagined, forging resilience amidst massive change, and the vulnerability, grace, and complexities of the Black experience. I want to take a moment to introduce you to the artists that I will be speaking with tonight, all of whom are in the exhibition. Jackie Brown explores how traditional materials like clay can be used in new and unexpected ways through emerging technology. Her iterative sculpture and installation work invites reverence for the natural world and is fueled by an interest in the gradual processes of accumulation and erosion. Leah Gauthier is an intermediate artist who makes wild-inspired embroidered paintings, living sculpture, and often edible community works, exploring resilience in the wake of climate change, food migration, and her dreams of an interspecies-centered future. Known for material investigation and process-based practices, Elaine K. explores human relationships to place and how we form knowledge, collectively and personally. Informed by a bilingual upbringing, incorporates notions of translation throughout her work, materially, literally, and metaphorically. Utilizing a multidisciplinary approach, Ashley Page's sculptural practice is a vessel for visibility into human stories and history. Centering the African-American experience, Page presents these stories as universal. Merging textile techniques with spatial sensibilities, her work is often a metaphor for the body, a vessel for the spirit, or a container for ephemera. Before we leave the slideshow, I'm going to use this image to lead us into our first question. Ashley, your practice often pulls in site-specific historical elements. I can't help but see your 4 thresholds as echoing the 4 columns of the Greco-Roman Revival Portico edition on our gallery. Viewed this way, your portals point to an alternate histories that manifest in the present, drawing a parallel to the Greco-Roman Revival architectural movement that rejected the aesthetic present they found themselves in. Although I must say I find your portals more emblematic of the choices we might have and sort of an antithesis or an antidote to the stoic, imposing, and conservative facade. So my question is this: how can we begin to better recognize the thresholds and precipices when they are of pivotal consequence to our future growth? And how might that growth really relate to alternate visions or interpretations of our pasts?
Thank you, Kat. And thank you to everybody who's here tonight. And thanks to my fellow exhibiting artists. This is a question that I have had the benefit of having access to prior to today's talk. And I have to admit, I don't know if there is any right or wrong, or, there is no one answer. And I think, when we think about how to reconcile with the site in which we're in, which for me is New England, it's Maine, and for this particular work, it is this really stylized art gallery. I can't help but think about, like, well, what then is our history? What exists here, and what has then brought us to this place and to the space that is now known as Maine, but is also historically and traditionally known as Wabanaki and Indigenous land. And so I think about the stories that this particular site and this particular space holds. And so, in a lot of ways, the portals are sort of these alternate realities. There are these alternate possibilities, these truths, depending on what is happening in one place of the world versus what's happening in another. And so for me, it was sort of an opportunity for me to explore the possibilities of alternate, and to think about, well, what if instead of turning right, we had turned left? Or, um, and it's also sort of for me a meditation on, well, what is happening in the world, and if you were to sort of think about it in this sort of exaggerated or dystopian sort of way and just hyper focus on one event or one happening, such as one of the far left images or portals, which, is sort of a combination or compilation of different images from the LA wildfires. Like that is one reality that's happening today, and is, sort of a natural disaster that we are encountering on various levels. But it is still something that we are sort of confronting, I think, as a society, and as a people. And so, but for it to also be backed with this sort of sense of like, well, what's on the flip side of this? Like, what does, a utopia look like? And what does the sense of exhale look like? And so, even on the far right of that particular wall, where you have just the images themselves, which are sort of these collaged photos of water and fog and flowers. And so it's like, well, what happens on the flip side of these things? So I don't know if that answers your questions because there are so many directions that it could take, but I think ultimately, when we think about what is possible, we really have to contend with, well, what's happening? And then how are we, these sort of harbingers of an alternate possibility while contending with, the sort of past, present, futureness of it all.
I really love that, thinking like what we are harbingers of possibility. That's going to reverberate around. And next week I'll have a question for you about that, I'm sure. Um, but my next question for now is for Elaine. I'm wondering how the past informs your work on growth. Your work feels slightly anachronistic, but I mean that positively. How can looking at historical practices allow us to realize more about our creative present?
Thanks, Kat. You know that it's a strange question. I get this question a lot about that relationship between looking into history, and I end up doing a lot of digging into historical pasts. And um, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why. It's always I guess you look backwards because that's what there is, right? Like everything future is imaginary. And so in grounding yourself, especially if you're interested in material and you work with material, which is where a lot of my creative drive comes from, is this curiosity about material behavior. I'm looking back to like what is this material's past? What have we done with it before? What have humans done with it before? How has it existed? And what's possible to do with that material at a very human scale? Like industrial use of material has only been a recent thing relative to the history of the earth and the history of humans. And so I think that's why I end up going back. It's I was with this other artist last summer, Claire Pentecost, and she talked about being interested in fundamental material culture. And we both had this, like all the things that we had explored went back to like, oh, I need string. Like how you like I can make string from what's around me. And it's like a very human impulse to do these things. And so like as I do this, a lot of what I'm thinking more about now is how so much of the way we interact with material is built over these thousands of years, and it's a human history that's global. Like working with indigo, every continent figured out indigo, which is not an easy thing to figure out, but all these human beings figured it out in their own way. And so, you know, that past is just what I'm using now in my present, but my present is built on all this. Like as artists work with materials, it seems like, you know, we're now, and we create something new and learn it now, but actually we're taught it by looking around at what exists, and that's built on thousands of years. And so I feel like the knowledge is passed down, whether it's a formal thing or whether it's a, you know, demonstrative, you watch somebody do it and you mimic it and you learn it. And we gather this kind of information. And so a lot of that is, I think, why the history ends up being part of it, because you know, I don't want to just imagine a little bit of that history or know a little bit of it. I'm curious to know. I would like to know the whole, but you know, I can't possibly. So I just do these deep dives into it, and end up off track, but comes together later.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to think about how all current knowledge is built upon other knowledge, and there's this sort of through line. Um, uh, Jackie, I have a question for you. I also see your practice as sort of decentering the human in favor of looking at the longue durée of geologic time. And I'm wondering if you see this aspect of your practice as sort of in tension with the communal relational aspect of the Life Forms Project, which is sort of community centered. I'm also curious if the play inherent in your process might have a role in bridging the blips of moments on the scale of epochs within which community forms.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. I think there is a tension between the two, right? But I also think there's a connection. The things that drive me to want to make this work and reflect on processes that are so much bigger than a human life, I think are some of the same drives and impulses that make us crave connection and make us want to pull together, right? Like communities form, at least in part, so we can have a sense of belonging in the face of uncertainty. And that's something my work is very much grappling with. And and then my process, yeah, there is this level of play, and it's very much about discovery and a desire to work with forces beyond my control. So in a way, it's about what kind of agency we have or don't have, and what it means to try to shape the world around us with our hands. And I see that as like this connection to that I'm after, to something bigger than myself and bigger than all of us, that is oddly comforting and unsettling at the same time, and really endlessly fascinating. And for me, it gets at those big looming questions about what it means to be alive and what it means to be human and what it means to be human at this particular moment in time. And I see all of that as related to those feelings of longing that make us crave connection and community and bring people together.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Um, and Leah, I have a question for you. Your practice explicitly aims to decenter the human element. And I'm hoping you can round us out with what a consideration of a future might look like, one in which there are different ways of defining growth that decenter humanistic elements in favor of a more an equilibrium with more than human worlds.
So we are already past climate change tipping points, and our collective survival depends on a decentered human world, since we're the sole cause of it, pretty much, and all life is interdependent. And approaches to this might include like holistic ecological awareness, greater recognition of the sentience of animals and plants, considering non-human agency and social justice. And indigenous cultures paved these paths thousands of years ago, really. I think for me, just taking one step forward would be to start telling a complete truth, a more complete truth. So with the effects of climate change, for instance, so we seem to tabulate our losses, whether it be natural disasters or wars or accidental occurrences in human lives and structures. So like planes, buildings, houses. So the losses from the LA fires were reported as 29 humans, 12,000 buildings, and 40,000 acres. And these are tragic, tragic losses. And I don't at all want to minimize any of that, but it's not the complete story. So for instance, there are on average 100 to 200 trees per acre of forest. And even if half of that was forested land, we're talking about 3 million trees, not to mention habitat loss, wildlife loss, potential species loss. So starting by acknowledging non-human losses and successes, I think would be a sign of growth.
Thank you, Leah. And my next question is for Ashley. Ashley, I see you as navigating this sort of tension that I mentioned in your work. You explicitly draw our attention to the communal nature of growth in an environmental context to reflect how anthropic communities mimic this trajectory. Your exploration of the seed pods and portals can be seen, at least for me, as akin to quantum physics, which holds that electrons can be in two places at once. And to quote philosopher Karen Barad, who I'm going to bring up, the beginning, like all beginnings, is already threaded with anticipation of where it is going, but will never simply reach and of a past that has yet to come. It is not merely that the future and the past are not there and never sit still, but that the present is not simply here now. Multiply heterogeneous iterations, all past, present, and future, not in a relation of linear unfolding, but threaded through one another in a non-linear enfolding of space-time mattering, a topology that defies any suggestion of a smooth, continuous manifold. Time is out of joint, dispersed, diffracted. Time is diffracted through itself. It is not only the nature of time in its disjointedness that is at stake, but also disjointedness itself. Indeed, the nature of dis and jointedness, of discontinuity and continuity, of difference and entanglement, and their impossible interrelationships are at issue. I'm thinking about the discontinuity of electrons or potentially seeds in their dispersal. These phenomena stir alternate imaginings of community for me, and I'd love to hear how you navigate the intersection of the communal against this backdrop of dispersal.
Yeah, that's such a rich and like loaded question. And I feel like I could almost like parse it apart and address sort of to the two sides of it that I'm seeing. And one of those is time and our relationship with time and how we encounter and engage with the past, present, and future. And I think a lot about, what I was sort of mentioning before in reference to whether it's sort of architectural structures, like the building itself or sort of iconic historical structures throughout Maine or that have some level of symbolism to them. But then also, the sort of human history. And I think Elaine spoke to that beautifully in the sense that we are a culmination of a human history that spans, through millennia and through time. And yet that history then gets erased or um, sort of repassed through a certain lens, and that is what is then dispersed throughout time or throughout a history and a legacy. So for me, in a lot of ways, I think one way that I would approach that question is um, just to sort of radicalize our idea of time and our relationship to it. And I think that quote of time is out of joint, dispersed and diffracted is something that I think about quite often because, our relationship with time is also a relationship with place and space and memory. And the way that that then gets integrated into a community or into, if we think about it on a larger scale, a society, is one that is ever changing. And so when I think about how that relates to, plants and seeds and um, just, that sort of metaphorical relationship that I am drawing lines to is that I think a lot about how plants mimic people, and I think maybe even to Leah's point about how we can have this sort of uns unhuman centered lens to the world around us. And so for me, I'm also thinking about like, well, how does the dispersal of people and culture and society and people like span out through time, but then also when you approach that through the lens of people, like what does that look like through the lens of plants? And then how can those plants then be a metaphor for the people? And I think, just even in sort of the botanical language, like there are certain terms like, indigenous plants or native plants or invasive plants or, those that same language then is also akin to the way that we talk about people. And so, I think a lot about how there are these sort of like parallel lives that are very much intertwined and for me sort of feel like um, like they are in some ways interchangeable, and how oftentimes a lot of these plants are also older than us. And, the things that they disperse, whether it be seeds or, even like a root network that happens underneath the soil, it to me just feels very much interconnected to, human nature and the ways in which we find connection with each other. So, around the phenomena of like, imaginings of community and things, when I think about it in my own sort of day to day, I think a lot about trees actually, and how certain species of trees. I think there is a book. I think it's called The Life of Trees actually, that that talks quite a lot about this, in the sense that, trees are so deeply connected in the way in which they communicate with one another and the way in which they acknowledge each other and protect each other. And so I think a lot about how that then serves as sort of an example or, something that people can take a lesson from in terms of how to show up in community, how to be together, how to build relationships with one another. And so, I think to Leah's earlier point, there's so much that we could learn, but also have lost in the sort of fracture of a human-centered society that alienates our relationship with the natural world around us. Um, and so, yeah, I could go on about that for a long time, but so I'll sort of like pull it back a little bit. But yeah, our relationship with time and with space directly mirrors our relationship with the natural environment around us. And I think there's, especially nowadays, a lot that we, are missing, um, and a lot that we need also.
I love thinking about that with the tree metaphor as like parallel lives above ground, but entangled below. It's a really interesting way to think about it. Also, I have to give a shout out to that Life of Trees book is great. There's another one called Entangled Life.
Mm.
Also seems like others are aware. It's such a good book about these subjects that we're all talking about right now.
I wonder if I can add one more book to the list. I'm looking around to see if I have it somewhere handy. I think it's in my studio. But there is a book by Jamaica Kincaid, called In the Garden, in which she addresses the ways in which, even in sort of like the botanical language lens, how, colonialism has just dwarfed what our relationship with these plants are. Just even in the name of them, oftentimes a lot of plants, like I think there's like frankincense or Franconia or like certain lilies and things are named after sort of colonial bodies. And that then shapes our relationship to it because, we then lose so much of the traditional knowledge and history of a particular plant as well. And so it's just another form of erasure, of history and presence through time. And is actually can be quite violent in that way. So that's the last thing I'll add about it, but I'll try to find that book and plug it into the chat for folks too who are interested.
Thank you. So kind of also thinking of this quote, Jackie, I was wondering how you think about the sort of infinitesimal scale of 3D print extrusions with the monumental characteristics that your work has taken on, particularly in the context of what it means to be nonlinear. So in particular, I'm interested in the practice of staggered and off-centered stacking in your sculptures, which mimics the plateaus and harkens to nonlinear conceptions of growth. Balance in your work seems akin to growth, occurring over vast expanses of time, unnoticeably to the subject, and yet simultaneously unfurling the delicate process of becoming. I'm wondering, how do you articulate a force as strong and unrelenting as growth while foregrounding the fragility of the object that it's enacted upon?
Yeah, thank you, Kat. I think, well, first, just talking about the scale, I love the way that sculpture can be experiential. It's often experiential. It's something we move around, it's something we move through. And with my tall forms, they almost have a figurative presence in the space. They tend to make you aware of your own physicality, your own body. And to me, that's really important with this work. Um, it's a way of bringing the monumental, these sort of larger than life processes of accumulation and erosion and the geological, bringing them to a human scale. And I've been sort of jokingly calling this the Gigantosaurus effect, where we become sort of giants in the way, where we sort of loom in relation to these. And so, and I think there's something really interesting about that. It creates this tension between a reverence for these timescales and these processes that are so much bigger than us, but are also vulnerable and affected by human activity. And so bringing them down to this human scale for me really underscores that. And then that sense of a precarious balance or something off kilter is really essential to these pieces too. And to me, that just gets at that idea that everything is always shifting, everything is always in flux, and it creates this tension between um, the power of something growing over time and accumulating over time, and then the fragility and impermanence of all things. So I really am interested in striking a balance and creating that tension between those two things.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, I feel like that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, especially like the fragility of these epochs that really are vulnerable to intervention. Um, and Elaine, I'm wondering about how this theme of disjointed time, um, which I thought was relevant in your practice, but now I'm sort of questioning that. But how this theme of disjointed time informs how you see the intellectual growth created through embodied repetitive movements that constitute the artistic practice.
And I'm curious why you're questioning it. Like
I
this-
guess I guess I don't think that you see time as disjointed based on this conversation. So, but I suppose if I were to reword it a bit, just how does the theme of repetitive movement, that constitutes the artistic practice, sort of inform how you see intellectual growth and its relationship to embodiment?
Yeah, the time thing is really interesting. And and it's something I think about a lot. Actually, it's like I feel like all of these topics are I see our group as like we're all considering many of these same things. Um, so I think repetitive practice and practice is something that's just been a part of my life since early on. I was a pianist, a classical pianist, and a big part of practicing is just repeating something over and over again. And when you're little, you don't really know why, but then, as an adult now thinking about it, it's something I've carried through to how I work with materials. I do it once, I do it lots and lots and lots of times in different materials. I begun to think of it as like a translation. And I think this repetition is it's a way of developing that knowledge. The first time you do it, let's say you're doing something physical, like playing the piano. The first time you do it, you're just figuring out where your fingers go, which notes you're supposed to hit. You're kind of connecting what you see visually with what you're doing physically. And you do that over and over again until we talk about like in your fingers. And I think all of us who work with materials, like I think all artists probably can relate to this at some level. You do it until you're not concerned about that. You've developed your style or your way of using that material. And so it kind of frees up the brain to think about something else. And so I, I've always kind of hated when people talk about like meditative work because it's not, I don't feel like it's that. I feel like something's building it's not like it's a freeing, but it's building. And maybe you could talk about this as growth. And the thing I've been thinking most recently about is the idea that is skill development a kind of intelligence development, a knowledge development? We don't use those words. The words we use are not the same, but every time you practice something, you develop your skill a little better. And so that's a physical embodiment of your brain knowing what to do. And so wouldn't that be also something you could consider as a form of intelligence? We have this limited view of intelligence being verbal. And, there's so many other kinds of intelligence. And this goes to like what Ashley, what all of you are saying, but Leah, especially, you were, talking about like different forms of life and how they know things or how they interact. Like they have their own system. And we're beginning to know about how plants can hear water, like they'll grow towards the sound of water. There's not even water there, but like, isn't that a kind of form of intelligence? And it's an embodiment in that being, whatever it is. And so this is, that's a lot of what I'm thinking about in repeating something, is like trying to hone in on these, like this way of growing knowledge that is not verbal, that's tacit, that's, something that you can only do by experiencing it.
Thank you, Elaine. Yeah, I think there's so much about embodied knowledge that we're just kind of beginning to, I think, really examine on an artistic level, and hopefully, I think that'll lead to more also, I don't know, a wider recognition of what that embodied and somatic and practitioner, performative, not performative in that you repeated, knowledge is. And Leah, my last question is for you. That quote that I read earlier, I feel it implies there might be multiple futures in which we can achieve an equilibrium with more than human worlds, but also maybe futures where that relationship doesn't occur. So I'm wondering how you define growth and coming together against a multifaceted backdrop such as that.
Thanks, Kat. That's such a wonderful question. Before I answer, I did want to also mention The Light Eaters, which is a really wonderful book about plant intelligence. So if you all want to add that to your list. So I think we have no choice but to come to terms, given the interdependency of everything, to envision and help actualize a world where everyone thrives. But like it's a challenge for most of us to get through the day, given the near constant drumbeat of catastrophic human drama. So how do you have enough space to hold possibility when you're absorbed in this day-to-day? But indigenous cultures have lived in harmony with nature for thousands of years, so it can be done. It is being done. It's just for the rest of us who haven't had the benefit of growing up with these expansive ideas, it's a major shift in thinking and being. And it's so weird, I happened upon this essay in Orion, it showed up in my inbox at the perfect time, called Love in a Time of Terror, and it's by Barry Lopez. And what he proposes is that he feels like our issue is a failure to love. And I just want to read this really quick quote because I just think I'm just really inspired by it. So, the evidence of failure to love is everywhere around us. To contemplate what it is to love today brings up against reefs of darkness and walls of despair. If we are to manage the havoc, the ocean, acidification, corporate malfeasance, government corruption, endless war, we have to reimagine what it means to live lives that matter, or we will only continue to push on with the unwarranted hope that things will just work out. We need to step into a deeper conversation about enchantment and agape, and to actively explore a greater capacity to love other humans. The old ideas, the crushing immortality of maintaining the nation state, the life-destroying beliefs that to care for others is weak and to be generous is foolish, can have no future with us. It's more important now to be in love than to be in power. It's more important to bring E.O. Wilson's biophilia, which is the innate ability to make connections with nature, into our daily conversation than it is to remain compliant in a time of extinction, ethnic cleansing, and rising seas. it's more important to live for the possibilities that lie ahead than to die in despair over what's been lost. And I was thinking about what Ashley was talking about possibilities. And that really inspired me, that we just really we need to imagine ourselves out of some of these ruts that we're in. And we definitely need to go there. We have to go there.
Thank you, Leah. At this point, I just want to invite the group to ask questions of each other. I think I had down that Ashley would kick us off.
I sure can. Wow, yeah, I'm still sitting with that quote a little bit. So, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, isn't that really something?
Yeah, I'm just like, please forward that to the rest of us. I'd love to read the whole essay. Well, my question is actually for Jackie. And I think where my question is coming from might actually also be my own sense and relationship to time, but again, maybe back to the sense of like possibilities and to your my understanding of your work. So my question for you is, with the experimental nature of your process and intuitive forms, I'm curious if you see them in a state of sort of disintegration or manifestation within their own imaginative timeline. Because I think in a lot of ways, your work to me feels like this suspended moment. And I'm curious how you approach that, or where you place them in the sort of in the world in which they exist.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I do think of them kind of like a frozen moment in the life of the work in a way. And as I'm making these things very experimentally, I'm sticking parts together. Things are slumping, they're warping, they're falling, and then I'm, building them up and adding more. So, and sometimes things morph or fall over in the kiln, and sometimes intentionally allow for that. So there is always this negotiation between a thing coming into being and kind of unbecoming at the same time, if that makes sense. So I very much think of them as definitely both this sort of state of growing and collapsing. And I think of entropy as an essential part of growth and not part of, and it's not a part of growth we often talk about, but things are always in this state of moving towards entropy, right? And destruction and decomposition are vital to that process of rebirth and new growth and evolution, right? I love the way that all matter becomes a source for new life. And I think about that like when you get up close to my sculptures, there's these glazes that sort of bubble and foam and crack on the surface. And I sort of think of that almost like bacteria or microorganisms in the way those like thrive in the nooks and crannies of all surfaces, right? Allowing for new growth to emerge from decay. So I definitely think of these as sort of in this frozen moment, this state of both becoming and unbecoming, and part of this endless process of transformation that happens through accumulation and erosion. Yeah.
Beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Elaine, I also just absolutely loved the way you talked about embodied knowledge and the way that um, we privilege certain forms of intelligence, and there are these other ways of knowing that often get undervalued. Leah, I have a question for you. I'd love to hear more about this idea of living sculpture that you're working with. And I'm curious if you have any insights into sort of what that means to you or how you think about that concept. I'm also curious what happens to these living sculptures after the exhibit. What kind of, where do they go, and how do you think about them? And then, yeah, maybe I'll stop there and let you answer that, but I have some follow-ups if we have an extra minute.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. You ask such great questions. Everyone, I wanted to just say, in reading through all of these wonderful questions about our work, like it just is so thought-provoking and inspiring. And I loved answering them, and I'll answer you now. So first, the plants come home, and I take care of them. And they're part of the family. So I keep acquiring new plants. So pretty soon I'll just be full of plants. But yeah, they always are cared for after they're exhibited. And a living sculpture to me, it means to work in collaboration with other beings. With this most recent work, it's more about making pieces that incorporate the plants. So they obviously had no say-so in terms of participation, but their welfare is of primary concern. And I want to, I think, expand as I go along upon this notion of art and nature in future works and cultivate what Robin Wall Kimmer refers to as a covenant of reciprocity, where we both benefit from this act of coming together. So years ago, I played an integral role in saving the nearly extinct Marshall strawberry. And I got 3 plants from the last 3 plants from the germplasm repository in Oregon, and personally grew and sent out 900 plants to backyard growers across the country. And so to me, it was a community art piece, and to this plant, it was survival. And, you know, and in community, we were able to save the Marshall. Marshall's no longer considered near extinction. So that would be an example to me of, like, you know, working in reciprocity where both parties benefit from us coming together.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. Those are just awesome questions. So Elaine, what truly resonates with me most about your work is the long arc your practice takes. It takes time and devotion to research, to grow plants, to make dye, to learn new to you skills from other cultures. And I wonder what delights you about working this way. What are your garden plans for the year? Do you search with focus or allow for revelation, or is it a balance of both? And what happens with outlier discoveries? Are they saved for another day?
That's a lot of questions. You know, it seems so linear. Like I'm sure we can all relate to this in a little bit. I mean, my arc is particularly long for my projects, and something I've recently just come to accept, that I work in these 3 to 5 year, like, just, you know, project discoveries. And it's not so direct. I don't have that plan when I start out. I just have an area of interest. Something fascinates me. And a lot of times it's more about, like, what can hold my interest long enough, and what keeps me going in it. And so that's what drives it. And you know, it's not as focused, like, as you would think, because I don't know what I'm looking for usually. I just know, like, this is the place I want to play in. And you know, the interests, like the very basic interests, are always similar. Like, it's like material behavior, chemistry, natural world, like plants, and, you know, cultural history. And like this project, this chintz project, began actually with, like, the cultural history of plants. I was annoyed at those words that were everywhere. Same like Ashley. I mean, we're on the same page. I was so annoyed by this. And so I just thought, I'm going to go research these plants, and then I'm going to see if I can use them in some way in my artwork, the history and that mesh together somehow. And I didn't know if that would happen. And I didn't expect to be introduced and to fall in love with chintz and find, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised, like, you know, all this old cultural knowledge of people working this way. And I mean, I knew it was there, but I didn't go to look for it. So that's really how these things happen. It sometimes it's years, like, you know, those video pieces I was doing with the bugs, that was 10 years. And, you know, I didn't start out like, I'm gonna do this thing. I just started out like, this fascinates me. And I was looking at like how bugs know where they're going. Why are they going across this gigantic parking lot? And I start observing things. It's a lot of observation. And it just I'm slow, like, takes me a long time to figure it out. but also, I mean, I'll stop there, but because I think we're running short on time, and can I ask Ashley a question? So I am also fascinated with seed pods, and I think we talked a little about this, but it's such a metaphor for people who may have moved, migrated, immigrated, been moved, and seeds. Kat, I think, was talking about it, like they have this protective covering, but they hold all this past, and seeds are always this thing of their past, and then they have potential to thrive when their conditions are right. And so I see this as like a beautiful metaphor for human diaspora. And I'm wondering how that factors into your thoughts about it, and personally or more generally.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. I was sort of holding off on diving into that too deeply earlier because I was anticipating this conversation. But I think really, you in your incredibly eloquent way really just nailed it just in exactly what you said and framing the question, which is the seeds for me are a metaphor for human diaspora. And for me, in the way that I approach that in my own sort of personal context, is also thinking about the African diaspora and the African American in the country that we're in. And the ways in which there have been, in my own research, just in, understanding my own family history, which, my father's family is from the South, and, so we have strong roots through Mississippi, but really through the sort of Great Migration, following, World War I, World War II, and recognizing that those habitats, those environments were inhospitable to life, quite literally. And so there was a movement of Black people, African American people, who were sort of moving north, and which is how you get such rich pockets of people throughout Cleveland, throughout Michigan, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, and where my family ended up, which is Minneapolis, Minnesota. And you can, there was a time where, and upon doing a lot of that ancestral research, I was looking at these sort of like great migration map. And just seeing these sort of patterns of people. And so for me, I was also thinking about this sort of intersection with food as well, because there's a Netflix series called High on the Hog, in which they talk about, like, they are in, Africa and Senegal and in Dakar, looking at like the source of where sweet potatoes come from, or where specific rice, and how, especially sort of in the height of the transatlantic slave trade, how people were taken from certain regions within the continent of Africa, specifically with the intention of, finding people that had specific material knowledge of how to harbor these crops in an environment, in a new environment like the Americas. So for me, there's this big through line from my work of like, well, how do, ideas, how do people, how do our relationship with sort of the natural environment, whether that be, the actual agriculture, or just the landscape as a whole, then dictate how we adapt to it. Because I find that so much, about African American culture and Black culture is about adaptability, and sort of taking something, whether it be a circumstance or a history or an ingredient, even just for food, and turning that into something that is familiar, or hybridizing it into something that is familiar, but also very new and unique to a new and emerging culture. So all of that to say, I think plants make the perfect metaphor for that, because in our own way, we are plants, so, and these sort of bodies that we inhabit, you know, th- they're very much related. So, um, yeah, that would be my answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them, but I will start with the earliest. Um, Julia asks, Lifeforms is self-described as an experiment in artistic community building. What are some of the lessons you're learning as contemporary artists, as a contemporary artist collective? Are there challenges or strengths?
We all want to just say a few things that we're experiencing. For me, it's just this camaraderie, community, sharing of resources, sharing of knowledge. It's just been such a rich and wonderful experience for me, working with these 11 artists, both during, putting these shows together, and then, as we meet up, during the year. We try to meet once a month if we can, via Zoom, or we have one in person. And it's been really wonderful for me.
I would just add too that we're still in the early stages of this, which is what I think is so exciting about it, is because it is a multi-year project that we're still kind of unpacking things and figuring out what we can share with each other, and how our practices overlap and where they diverge, and what it means to try to foster community. Yeah.
Bronwyn asks, can you speak to how it was for you to plan and enact the placement of your work in the University of Southern Maine space together? How did you do it? What concerns and conversations arose in the process? I can jump in if necessary, but honestly, I feel like I really left a lot of decision making to the artists in this case.
I think we were lucky that it went as smoothly as it did. Being the first group, we ended up with a lot of there were back-to-back things from the fall, and so it was holidays. And I think when we brought the work together, like because the group was formed with a theme already, there was some natural curation in that, and so the works kind of spoke to each other that way. But to be honest, I was really pleased with how the works were interacting once we got them in the space. And then it was a lot of pushing things around, literally.
Yeah, to add on to that too, I think, we sort of had the privilege of being very aware of what, each person was working on and thinking about. And, there were some folks like myself who was making a lot of new work, who, for me, I was like, I can talk about what this looks like, kind of, but I'm not going to be able to show you a photo of it. But then we were also really grounded, by Jackie, because and Elaine too, because you had a really clear sense of what you were doing because you already had the work. And so we could sort of say, well, Elaine shaking your head. But like in the sense of like knowing we want to have a process table and prints, knowing that Jackie was going to have these freestanding sculptures. And Leah and I were like, okay, we know kind of what we're doing, or at least I could say that for myself at least. And so, we sort of met in that soft space of like, let's just make space for each other, while also, just respecting each other as artists and what we can contribute. But I think it also began to be pretty real, like once we brought all of the work in the space. And yeah, that's when it felt like the most collaborative portion of the overall project.
And I think what also helped me was that we had our 12-person show at Speedwell. It came down just as this one was coming up. And so it was really wonderful to see everyone's work in the room and kind of begin to envision larger shows of a smaller group within that framework. So even though it was a really tight turnaround, I felt like for me, that segue really informed what we're doing at USM.
One thing I really appreciated was I think I did push a little, but I think it was also embedded in your work was sort of spreading all of the work throughout the space so that it didn't feel like one person's work is here and one person's work is here. You can really see the relationships that way. And I think this is a good one to end on. I'm not sure who wrote it because I think it's one of Leah's guests, but they said, fascinating conversation, but we are really talking to each other in a way that we easily understand. How do we talk to our neighbors, the checkout person at the grocery store, 16-year-olds, our parents about the same issues? Time, place, choices, the importance of being kind, respect for our fellow beings in the natural world. These are essentials that we all, I mean, all need to consider. I don't know if I have an answer, but I want to express my appreciation for this group because I think the first step is at least to talk, like here, and we can begin to think about how we can branch out from here. But I'm wondering if anyone else has any thoughts.
I would add that, you know, the other side of talking is listening and hearing the questions and the other things that are coming up. And I feel like that's an easy thing to fall into, of like being the talker.
I would also say one piece of this that, you know, I was so excited to join this group of artists and be able to learn from these artists and have this artistic community together. But the piece that's become almost even more exciting to me is that through these different exhibitions over time, in all different parts of Maine, at all different venues, we're able to connect with different groups of people and different communities and have different kinds of conversation through things like this, through openings, through other events. Um, and that to me is exciting and meaningful.
Yeah, I really have to agree with Elaine, and you too, Jackie, in the sense that listening is such a big part of a conversation, and not just like hearing what someone says in anticipation of saying the next thing, but really understanding where someone is coming from. And I'm also, I am one of the only, well, yeah, one of the only artists in my family. So when I think a lot about like, how are we able to have this conversation and all be on the same page? That I would not be able to say these same things and have it translate to like a family dinner, because people would be looking at me like, what does that mean? And what are you talking about? And so when I think a lot about just how to approach these same kind of topics with with others. I'm a big fan of like talking like a human, like how do you just be approachable in your language and understand also where people are coming from and give them the benefit of the doubt of meeting you in the middle. Um, and so that's all I would have to offer to that, is just also recognize where you are currently standing um, in a conversation or in a place or position, whatnot, and then how can you then like build little steps or a bridge to where whoever you're engaging in conversation or are around really to meet you there as well.
Thank you, everybody. We're at time, just passed. I do just want to make a moment in case anyone has anything else they want to share.
I just would want to thank you, Kat, so much. I think you are such an integral part of this whole experience, from being your openness to receiving us, to helping us with installation, to all of your work. Wonderful questions. Like you've just been fantastic. And I just wanted to thank you for all of your hard work.
Thank you so much. I always feel that Zoom goodbyes are kind of odd. It's like you close it and then you're not in this community that you were just in a moment ago. So I just want to make room to let everyone know how much I appreciate everyone who has attended tonight, and how much I appreciate all the artists, and how I will still be thinking about this conversation probably for like a while to come, but definitely for the rest of the night. So know that we are all still being held in community even once our screens close. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
you.
Thank you so much, Kat. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.